Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and our center is working to place empathy as a primary social and cultural value. And today I'm here with Janet Blank-Libra, and I've got a little bio here on you. It says you're a professor, director of journalism, and chair of the English and Journalism Department at Augustana University in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and that you teach courses in journalism as well as foundational courses in composition and literature. You're the author of Pursuing an Ethics of Empathy in Journalism, and I've got the book here. Thank you very much. Signed copy by you, and it's all marked up with a lot of highlighted notes I've made about it. And you have a website too, or a blog, janetblanklibra.com, or sort of. It was a little bit there. It seemed like you periodically post there. So thanks for joining me to talk about your book, Journalism and Empathy. And is there anything else by way of introduction that I didn't get there?
No, I think that was a very nice introduction. Thank you.
Oh, great. So we want to talk about your book, and I thought one way we could maybe start is, you're talking about the need for empathy in journalism, and that it's been the topic. I mean, the main focus has been on objectivity, and you're saying, well, we need to bring empathy into this, into the journalism, as well as compassion. And so I thought maybe we could start with definition of what you're meaning by empathy, because I've seen you've got so many footnotes in this, so you've really studied the field, and that there's so many different definitions of empathy, and you never know what people are talking about. And so kind of how are you kind of defining empathy?
I think that I define it as many in the field of empathy research do, and that's as being composed primarily of two components. One, the affective, wherein I register within myself the feelings that you're feeling. I feel them within me as if they were my own. And then cognitively, that I am able to, in a discerning way, establish the nature of your emotion and take on your perspective as if it were my own. So one has more to do with actually feeling what you feel, and the other has, I guess, more to do with the mental processes that come with the intelligence of the emotions.
Okay, well, one way I was thinking of setting this up is if we have two people, if somebody comes and they're really hopping mad, like, oh, I'm so pissed off, I'm so angry, and they're literally hopping mad, and they come and they sit down in front of somebody else. Where is the empathy within that relationship? What are the different parts of empathy? I don't know if you've looked at the work of Dan Batson.
Yeah.
He's been working on the topic of empathy for 40 years or something, and he defines empathy kind of starting from two people talking to each other, and he goes through all the different ways that they might be relating, and how different people or academics are kind of naming different components of that interaction as empathy. So here's this person hopping mad, you're sitting in front of them. Where does the empathy come in? Where does the effective empathy come in for you?
I think it would come in if you were able to actually, given the way in which you were connecting with them and the way in which your mirror neurons are firing, you would be able to feel what it is that they're feeling and then respond. I think that if someone's hopping mad, you can't respond by acting in kind. You can't become hopping mad as well, especially if you're a journalist. You have to be calm. But I think if they're hopping mad, you can comprehend what it is that they're feeling, and then you can respond accordingly. If you're a journalist, you could think about the way in which your understanding of what they're feeling or what you believe they're feeling, you could think about that and ask questions to try to tap into what it is. And in being able to do that and not ignoring the emotions, but in engaging the emotions, you could better understand where that person's coming from. It doesn't mean you have to agree. Maybe they're hopping mad about something you think they shouldn't be hopping mad about, but you don't have to agree, but you should be able to respond in an accurate way to what it is that that person is feeling.
Well, the way I look at it, this is just a dialogue. Feel free to ask questions, or we're just chatting here to kind of explore this topic of empathy and building a culture of empathy in journalism. So, for me, what empathy is in that situation is sort of like based on the work of Carl Rogers. In terms of feeling into the experience of the person. So the person is hopping mad. And for me, the empathy is I hear you're hopping mad, tell me more. So, well, I'm really mad because somebody just put me down. They just, they cut me off while I was driving or whatever the reason is, or maybe, and then it's like, then I feel, oh, so you're really upset because someone, cut you off while you were driving and you're just feeling, really angry about that. And then I hear and sort of feel into their experience. And then they keep revealing more by being present with them. I think a journalist is the same way, right? The journalist is listening and sort of feeling into hearing the experience of the other. So is that sort of...
Yeah, and then that's going to affect the questions that you ask. And if you weren't engaging with the person in that way, feeling into the experience with them, you might not ask those questions and you'd miss out on a whole lot of information that could potentially take your story much, much deeper. So to be afraid of the emotions is to limit what it is that we're capable of doing as writers. And it's not fair to the other person. Journalism is designed to be, we aim to be fair, right? Unbiased, and that would not be fair. And perhaps it's even biased to sort of prefer not to engage those emotions.
Well, do you know the book Against Empathy by Paul Bloom? Have you heard?
I do, yes.
Well, for ages, I tried to talk to him for 4 years. I tried to have like a dialogue with him, and he refuses to talk with me. And I could never understand what he was talking, all his criticisms of empathy. And I finally understood that in this scenario of, the person's hopping mad, you're sitting there listening to him. For him, empathy is if you become hopping mad, right? Yeah. So that is the core of his book is that, and I don't even see that as empathy. I actually see that as like a block to empathy. So what he's criticizing is actually, I would agree that that's actually, I don't agree that that's empathy. I just think that that's like against empathy, that mirroring. So anyway, that's what I'm trying to look at is kind of the nature. So the effective empathy, do you see effective empathy then as the feeling into the hearing of someone else's experience and just kind of taking that in? You don't take it on, but you sort of are feeling into it. Is that then what we're saying by effective?
Yes, and you can understand that feeling. You know that because you're a human being too, right? Mm-hmm. So you know what that feeling is all about, and we can respond. I find it difficult to understand those who are against empathy. It seems to me that in being against empathy, they're really for limiting who we are as human beings. We have these amazing capacities that came with us. We're biologically wired. And why shouldn't we try to understand it and put it to work optimally?
Yeah, well, with that criticism from Paul Bloom, it seems to be about a misunderstanding or a different definition of empathy. Yeah. So, in the sense that if you as a journalist are trying to hear somebody's story and they have a lot of anger or something, then you become angry and it becomes about you. It seems like you're actually blocking your empathy and for them. So it would actually seem like a block to empathy versus actually being empathy.
Yeah, it seems as if in that case, really fear is a bit of an obstacle. It's that ancient fear that empathy or any kind of an emotion is only likely to lead us astray, that we can't rely on it to lead us to legitimate knowledge. It's not, valid and reliable. And so we fear it instead of embrace it and try to figure out how to develop it so that we can be better at empathizing and believe that perhaps we're doing it effectively. Because of course, I can be mistaken about what someone is feeling. I can get it wrong, but that doesn't mean that I should be afraid of trying. I mean, I came wired to be empathetic in the world, and I think we need to develop it and train. And you work with training, right?
Yeah.
In empathy.
Yeah, and when you say that like journalists or that there's this fear of empathy or the feelings, there's a fear of feeling. Yeah. What feelings are they afraid? Do you think is the fear from? Is it the anger that the person has, that they're afraid of that anger, or are they afraid of their reaction to that anger? Do you know what I mean?
Both. Maybe both. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it be a discomfort? I think we've been taught because of our adherence to reason as the best method of inquiry in the world. We've been taught to be leery of the emotions, and so I think there is for many a discomfort there, and so you back away from and you create distance instead of the intimacy that you need if you're going to be empathetic with someone. So that, to create distance as opposed to break down the barriers and get closer. That's not something everybody's comfortable with.
Yeah. Well, in the therapeutic world, that's kind of the thing therapists are taught is to be present with whatever feelings come up and then move into those feelings. And it's sort of this empathic presence that creates a sense of safety in a way, at least for me. It's like I feel grounded in my own sense of being willing to empathize and really hear what's behind that person's anger and get down to the core. It could be like, well, the person's wife just left them and he feels really, actually afraid or whatever, and then being cut off just set off some anger. And so really hearing what's kind of behind that and feeling into the experience of the other. So how do you then, that's okay, so we're kind of in agreement there that's sort of what we're talking about when we talk about affective empathy. We're feeling into the experience of someone else. And there could be two people. One person standing is really angry, another person is really sad, and we're feeling into the person's sadness and feeling into what their experience is, or into the anger. So then you were mentioning the cognitive component. So where do you see the cognitive component in this setup that we're talking about?
I think that it has a great deal to do with our ability to actually understand the other and identify what that individual's perspective is, and then try it on for ourselves.
Okay.
And it might be one that we find actually maybe even repulsive. Maybe we're sitting with someone whose ideas we believe to be immoral, right? But we're going to try to comprehend that perspective by trying it on within ourselves, and we may not like what we find there, and we may find we don't want to go as deeply as we could into that other person's perspective. I mean, the easy example is Adolf Hitler. There are those who say that if we had empathized, and that sounds just terrible, right? If we had empathized with Adolf Hitler, but empathy doesn't ask us to agree with anyone. It just invites us to understand. And so if we had better understood the evil that he represented, we might have responded differently or more quickly, or the world in general.
So how would you do that, empathize with Hitler? Like, how would you sort of approach that that exercise? What would you do to?
You know, if you're choosing to understand someone, you're choosing what for you is a kind of a moral response. And so what would I do in the case of Adolf Hitler? If you go into a situation, if you go into a conversation with someone like that, whose perspective you really abhor, you typically ought to be going into that conversation with a lot of knowledge about what that person represents, so that you can ask questions that will allow you to go more deeply into why it is that he, in this case, believes as he believes, and get closer to what that perspective is for him. But I think that in that case, you really do have to have gone through a process of reflection and research to get you there. Otherwise, I don't know, it can sometimes be very difficult, if not impossible, I think, to empathize with someone, especially someone whose perspective is so different from your own. I don't know if that's answering your.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to really nail this down, this definition part, because like these terms get so murky, and I've been working on this for 15 years, and I get really confused. And I said, okay, I'm going to nail this down. I'm not going to create these scenarios, and I want to know which part of this story are people talking about, you know? And so what I'm hearing from you is that you do research about who the person is, for one part, in terms of getting that cognitive empathy, and that when you're trying to empathize with him, would it be like an in-person interview? I mean, an in-person cognitive empathy, or because he's dead now, can we empathize with him since he's dead? You know, is it still possible to empathize cognitively with him? I guess.
Yeah, we know a lot about him, I guess, so maybe we can. I hadn't thought about that before, but maybe we can. We know a lot about what he thought. We know a lot about the evil of what it was that he represented in his way of being. So, you know, to take on his perspective as my own, that's the repulsive thing, right? I don't know.
Yeah, sometimes it's kind of confusing what even taking on someone's perspective is. I'm really going to kind of harp on this. I'm sorry to go into this detail, but it's like, for me, I see this word cognitive empathy come up, I mean, all the time, and it tends to come out of the academic community, I think, because they're very cognitive and analytical, and I think it's a sense of wanting to make themselves important or something. But so maybe I don't know. I'll skip that. So
well, I think it has to do with maybe it's Martha Nussbaum who puts it this way, but it has to do with the way in which we're both receiving and processing information, and that makes it a cognitive, a mental process. So we're receiving information, we're processing information, and at the same time, we're sort of trying it on within ourselves, that feeling into, as you said. So I think that there are a couple of different avenues into the way in which we experience empathy. But for me, it's that notion of, that makes sense. I'm receiving information, I'm processing that information, I'm making sense of that information, and because I'm doing all of that, I'm understanding better the emotional components.
So when you see that the person is hopping mad, you kind of hear the story, and you start creating a picture, sort of like, what is their intention? You know, why are they doing what they are? And you create sort of a picture of who they are. And I'm wondering, is that like cognitive empathy, is having that picture of who the person is that's hopping mad? Or there's another aspect. Sometimes that cognitive empathy gets kind of overlapped with sort of an imaginative empathy, almost like a role playing, like an actor. And I think that's actually a better term. I don't know what you think about this, but that the imaginative empathy is more like an actor, that the person is hopping mad and they say, I'm really mad because my wife left me and I got cut off in traffic. So I can take that, say, oh, if I'm this person, I'm really mad because, my wife left me and I got cut off in traffic, getting here. And then I can take that on as a role, almost like, Meryl Streep or something as an actor, right? I take on, Meryl Streep is taking on, Margaret Thatcher or Julia Child or whoever. And she's sort of like role playing it from kind of being that person. And so I'm wondering, is this what people are meaning by cognitive empathy? Or is it more that perspective, creating sort of an understanding of who the person is versus?
Maybe the understanding, but I think that being able to for Meryl Streep to be able to take on as her role what it is that's happening with someone else, certainly she has to have that understanding to be able to do that. When you first started talking about this, I was thinking about something that I read by Franz de Waal, the primatologist, who says that, that empathy doesn't start in the upper echelons, the lofty imagination, those regions that we would call the imagination, but that it's much simpler than that, that you hear the ape laughing and you laugh, or you see someone yawn and you yawn. It's that really basic response. And I like that definition, that way of thinking about empathy, that somebody yawns and you yawn, somebody, and it can be small things or it can be something larger, more consequential, like a difficult emotion and someone is suffering. And so you respond to that in kind as well and feel it within yourself. So yawn to yawn, or feeling their deep sorrow within yourself. And so there are some levels and degrees.
Mm-hmm. And the baby cries, right? The studies that when a baby hears others cry, that it takes that on and starts crying. So I really like that too. That's kind of my view too. Is he has he calls it the Russian doll model of empathy. So that resonance that you're mentioning is like kind of the core. And then there's other layers. So one layer is we get to a certain age that we have, a sense of self and others, and we can actually imagine being someone else.
Yes.
So for me, actually a better term than, cognitive empathy is imaginative empathy, in that sense that we're imagining. I think you even mentioned that. I think you say empathy is the act of connecting imaginatively with another, an act that generally precedes compassion.
That's
so
lovely.
Now you said it.
That's good.
Does that really resonate? I got a little, kind of a highlighted that part. So that's kind of how I'm seeing is like you're saying, the Waal, we're resonating with those feelings that they come across, and that we can also add other layers of sort of imagining, sort of doing a role play, stepping into the role of the other person and imagine. And I've seen that having done, mediation, training. The people do role plays and then, go into sort of mediation, like to play out a conflict. And it's amazing how good people are at taking on roles and then working through them. So,
that notion of resonance and transportation that I talked a little bit about in the book. And I think some of that comes from the work of Paul Zak and others, that notion that, and I read a little bit about you, and I know that you loved the book, The Call of the Wild. and so, if you're reading The Call of the Wild, you can be transported into that world of John Thornton and his dog, Buck.
Buck, that's right. Even named my dog Buck.
Yeah, I know. I saw that too. And you get transported into that world, and you do feel what those characters are feeling. And I think that the way we engage with literature teaches us, and Martha Nussbaum talks about that a great deal in her work, and so does Robert Solomon, teaches us, how to be more empathetic and how to develop that capacity. within ourselves.
Yeah, and another component that you had mentioned is the integrative part of empathy, that empathy integrates. I think you mentioned it several times in your book, that seems to be a value for you. Is like, how do we integrate our understandings, our sort of emotional felt experience with each other?
Yeah. Well, I think that journalism hasn't been a very integrative an integrative kind of profession, or our approach to our work isn't integrative, because we learn, and this is changing. And, one of the arguments that I make on my book is that the best journalists are naturally empathetic, but we learn, and I learned as a student, and still many of the textbooks today emphasize the importance of objectivity. And so if we adhere to that line of inquiry dominantly, we end up ignoring our other capacities, one of which, of course, is empathy. And a truly integrative process or approach would allow us to bring those together into the work of inquiring into the world and events and people. But that's not what it's been. We've not, people go through journalism training and they've not been invited to do that by the profession. And we know that that's so, because when journalists do behave empathetically and compassionately, people notice. And the fact that they're being compassionate becomes the story. And I think that's really sad that becomes news, that journalists are being empathetic, journalists are being compassionate. That shouldn't be news. That should be our everyday way of engaging with the world.
Is there an example of that you're...
Well, I know that after Hurricane Katrina, and that's getting to be a little while back, but then this past fall, Hurricane Harvey, when journalists were conducting themselves empathetically, compassionately, people talked about it. Oh, look what they're doing, as if, how novel is this? And I think that's sad. I think that we should be allowed access to our greater humanity, and that we should approach our work in a more expansive way and allow for the full range of our human capacities. There are a few authors whose work I've read who have used that language, the full range of our human capacities. And I think that that's really what I want to say more than anything else in my book, is that we should be allowed to engage the full range of our human capacities, because that's how we're going to get to the bottom of what our potential is as a human being. I mean, if we're limiting ourselves, how are we going to get there?
Yeah.
Work a lot of the day.
Mm-hmm. Well, that kind of, what is the human potential in that sense, in terms of like the relationship, that person that's sitting down in front of you that's hopping mad, right? For me, the empathy is I'm listening to them, I'm hearing what it is that their experience is. And I think you even mentioned that for you, compassion is actually that listening and the healing aspect of the listening. And you probably experience that in journalism too, as you're interviewing people, that just paying attention to them and listening to them has a healing kind of an aspect to it. And did I hear that correctly in your book, that's what part of compassion is for you?
Yes, I think so. Because if you're sitting with someone who's suffering, or someone who's vulnerable or disadvantaged in the world, and if that person has felt as if he or she hasn't had a way to be heard, then offering that individual a chance to have a voice is going to be a compassionate act, and one would hope ultimately could alleviate the pain of being ignored. It's a terrible thing to be ignored in this world.
Yeah.
There are far too many people whose lives are misunderstood or are misrepresented, and unfortunately by the media, and in various ways. But I do think that we have an obligation, if we're reporters and writers, to bring greater understanding and to debunk stereotypes and to lift up truths that get buried under assumptions and so forth.
Well, that's going back again to that person that's hopping mad. When you're listening to them, you're hearing them, and you start moving into their experience of they're mad, they've been cut off, they're sad because the person's wife left them, And then, they might go into tears, right? Like if you keep hearing, you hear the full range, and just the sense of presence of being with that person can be sort of a healing aspect. And journalism has that same kind of a quality. And then I guess there was the integrative component. So, and that's where I guess we move into, I think you addressed it too, a little bit about relational empathy, in the sense that there's been sort of a individualistic understanding of empathy, come out of the psychology and so forth. And there seems to be a move towards more relational empathy, seeing the relationship of in people's relationship, and how do we empathize with each other, and how do people empathize with each other. So if I'm here and there's a person who's hopping mad comes in, and then there's a person who's a third person who's in total grief and despair, it's like, how do we, the three of us, dialogue and hear each other and sort of integrate and connect? And that would be for me. And then how do people hear where I am eventually as well? So it's kind of, that's what I'm calling a culture of empathy, or relational empathy, is that we all hear and connect and understand each other and kind of.
Yeah. Well, if I can maybe back up a little bit, journalism has a long now relationship with objectivity, and objectivity by definition requires detachment. So immediately you're putting distance between yourself and whoever else you're with in that room, and so there is no way that empathy can occur. You cannot take on in yourself the feeling of the other, or really try out that perspective. It's impossible, because objectivity is a barrier to that. It's about distance as opposed to closing the distance. And so I think that we need to acknowledge that's what objectivity is. It's a subject-object kind of relationship. I really love the work of Martin Buber. And Martin Buber, the philosopher, didn't talk about empathy, but he talked about dialogue and about bringing people together in dialogue in such a way that all parties were equal. And as soon as we become equal in our humanity, then that notion of my objectifying someone will go away, right? Because we have an equal relationship, not a subject-object relationship, but as Martin Buber put it, an I-thou relationship. And so you can come together in your equality and have that conversation. And if you've actually managed to achieve that, then you're going to listen carefully and deeply. And Krista Tippett talks about creating a discipline of listening. And I think that's what happens in that, what Buber calls the sphere of the between. You listen deeply and you can create a relationship out of that equal way of being in that moment. And that's not always, I mean, if I'm, I think I'm having a good conversation with you, but there are all kinds of conversations within which someone is in a position of authority or position of power, and that can be the case certainly in a relationship that exists between a journalist and a source. Every time a source says yes, I just said this to my students today, every time a source says yes to an interview, that person makes him or herself vulnerable instantly. So how do you sort of level the playing field so that you can have an authentic, good conversation, one within which you've earned that person's trust, and so they're willing to open up to you. If there's no reason for them to trust you, then they're going to limit what it is that they say to you. And if you're a journalist, then your story is going to be less than it might otherwise be. It's not going to go as deep as it might. You're not going to tap into the emotional components that could lead to more questions, that could lead to more understanding. And it just sort of, I think, balloons. My hands get busy, sorry.
Oh, my hands move too. I think it's great. I like to express
my students laugh at me.
I'm very hands-oriented. Somehow my ideas get expressed in the hands, and I can see them and feel them better.
They do. So I'm glad you can empathize with that.
I do. I don't know if that's empathy. That's sort of like I have the same experience. So, all right, it would be. if I empathize, it would, in a sense, it would be like, well, what I'm hearing is that you feel concerned about moving of your hands. Am I hearing you correctly?
That's it. Perfect. Here's the example we needed.
Is there more? Can you tell me more about that? I'm hearing that people judge you. You feel judged about it as well.
Oh, I'm busy here. I don't really feel that. Yeah.
Oh, see, I was inaccurate in my hearing of you, understanding. So what I'm hearing now is you don't feel judged about that.
No, but they do notice, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah. So, yeah, these are really subtle concepts, at least for me. It's like, it's like, how are you approaching someone in an objective way versus in that empathic, connecting way, and how to really show that and convey it, and so I guess I wonder in that scenario where there's the person sitting in front of you who's hopping mad, the other person in deep grief, and what would be the objective? How would somebody approach that objectively versus, and comparing that to an empathic way? It's like, oh yeah, so feeling okay. I don't know. It's like to be able to really compare the felt experience. I mean, there's I guess with the objectivity is you don't like share yourself, who you are. It's just, I'm a detached person. I'm not going to share who I am in this relationship. Or
well, I think one of the worst synonyms for objectivity, and it is a synonym besides dispassionate, as one, is indifference. And so there could be, in your distancing yourself, what would at least appear to them to be an uncaring approach. You don't care how they're feeling. Well, why would they want to talk to you?
Mm-hmm.
You don't care how they're feeling. So I think that, objectivity and indifference, and it's easy to get in trouble here, but those are the synonyms for the word. Objectivity, you look it up, indifference is one of the synonyms, dispassionate is one of the synonyms, detachment. So if they're sitting in front of you and they're hopping mad, you're going to want to have that come to a stop so that you can get on with it, I think. I don't know if there's I don't know if I'm answering that as well as I'd like to, but you're not going to seek, if you're truly being objective, and I think most people would find it pretty hard to be fully objective in that situation, but in an extreme sense, if you were really practicing objectivity, you might detach from the situation too much so, and therefore not, I hate this word, but make use of the potential there for better understanding.
So that there'd be a feeling of a wall between that person and their anger. Like you can sort of, a lot of this is very subtle. It's like a felt experience, and how to kind of convey it is always a struggle for me. But there's a sense of a wall versus a feeling of going into that anger and moving into it.
Yeah. And, and people do, sometimes they simply cannot or will not connect with the emotion that the other person is expressing. I mean, in a personal way, several years ago now, I was sitting with someone and had been telling them about something that was distressing me. And the tears started coming down my face. And the individual I was with did not acknowledge my tears, did not acknowledge my pain, and kept treating the conversation as if as if that weren't a part of it. And honestly, it was quite alarming. I don't know that I've ever been in a situation quite like that before, wherein I felt I was completely unheard, and that there was a distance put between and what that person wanted, as far as the way in which our conversation should have been going, I think.
So what I'm hearing there is that you were in tears, you were in grief, and that person didn't even acknowledge that, didn't even say anything to it. And so a more empathic approach might have been, oh, I'm seeing that you're feeling some grief and some sadness.
And let's talk about that.
Yeah.
And help me understand what you're feeling. Right? I think there's nothing wrong with just asking. Help me I see your pain, acknowledge it, and then help me understand what you're feeling. And certainly journalists sit with people who are suffering. And I think that the best journalists do exactly that. They work hard to understand what someone is feeling. But despite the fact that I really do believe that there's a lot of good journalism going on out there, and there is a lot of good journalism going on out there, the profession hasn't fully embraced the potential of other ways of approaching the work. Not fully embraced it. There's still skittishness, this belief that if somebody thinks that I'm empathetic, then they're probably going to think that I'm biased and opinionated too, right? And empathy, of course, is not biased. Quite the contrary. You have to set your own perspectives aside to try on somebody else's. So it's an unbiased act, right?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of parts there. One is just what's really resonating for me was like a little light bulb about the acknowledgement. When you mentioned the word acknowledgement, it's that it's to create that empathic space. It's to acknowledge what you're seeing, as well as it maybe even acknowledge what's going on in oneself, in the sense that that person who is kind of ignoring or had that wall up could have said, you know, I see you crying or tearful, and I feel lost about how to address that. I feel concerned and worried because I don't know how to deal with this, and this is throwing me into some kind of a sense of confusion, and I feel myself withdrawing from this. So they could have acknowledged what their felt experience was, in terms of maybe that's why they were putting up that wall. And if they were more grounded, then they might have been able to acknowledge the deep emotion, feelings that you were having. So it seemed like that really, when you mentioned acknowledgement, it seemed like a really pivotal aspect of how to develop this empathic relationship.
And that individual's discomfort was obviously a barrier.
Yeah.
Empathy and understanding. It couldn't happen. The barrier was up, as you said, the wall, and it was not going to happen. It couldn't until the barrier, was removed, and it wasn't.
And so maybe one way of teaching empathy is to teach becoming more self-aware and being able to, as well as awareness of others, and being able to learn to acknowledge that. Yeah. That it's almost like we need a course in acknowledgement, and saying acknowledgement is a positive thing to do. Because a lot of times you feel like you got to kind of protect, at least I feel that, it's like, growing up or whatever, you kind of protect all your insights. There's sort of a secret garden, instead of just saying, oh, I feel this, and I'm seeing this within you. And so that's maybe that self, I don't know if you use the term self-empathy, of feeling into your own sense. Yeah.
And that's hard. Apparently studies show that that's hard for people to do. I think I'm can I look at a note here? I think
sure. This is a open.
The work of Ronald Epstein, and his article is entitled, it's about a decade old, Reflection, Perception, and the Acquisition of Wisdom. And he one of the points that he makes is that our mental processes are often more unconsciously than consciously engaged. And so we don't always fully comprehend what we're feeling or even thinking.
I have unaware. We're saying we're not aware of what we're thinking. It's like a subconscious.
Or how we're thinking. If we're doing critical analysis about something, we're not in our head saying, I'm doing, this analysis that I'm doing in my head, right? That we recognize what our cognitive process is in that moment. He goes on to say, we are often unaware of exactly which memories, perceptions, and assumptions affect our actions and our judgment. Without awareness, we cannot validate or disconfirm them. And sadly, we often resist recognizing our own vulnerabilities. And if we resist recognizing our vulnerabilities, like maybe we possess the capacity to always be judging people, if we don't really want to believe that of ourselves, then we're going to have a lifelong barrier to empathy. And it will stand in the way of our getting closer to and understanding people better.
Yeah, that's another aspect of self-empathy and empathy, is that by someone, I find that someone empathizing and listening to me and me sharing my feelings helps my own self-empathy, in the sense that if you're interviewing someone, it actually assists them in feeling into their own felt experience and revealing, that 98% that's in the subconscious. So the empathy actually supports, and I think the other part you were talking about is that the relational empathy, and I think that's something that gets missed, is that I do something called an empathy circle. So we do mutual, reflective, empathic listening with each other in small groups. So everyone becomes part of the relationship. And that's, I guess you were saying before about the journalist. The journalists to realize that they are in a relationship and they are part of the relationship and they have something to share as well. And this kind of comes up, what you're talking about, Buber, is, he had a dialogue with Carl Rogers, and he told Carl Rogers, you're never going to get to an I-thou relationship in therapy, because the therapist is always the person doing the empathizing into, but it's not a mutual, it's a professionalized relationship. So you're never going to get into that deeper relational I-thou relationship. And I don't know what you think about that.
I think that can apply to journalism too, if we allow for for a subject-object kind of relationship to continue. But I do think that we can deliberately move away from that, and particularly at times when we should. If I'm sitting with someone who's vulnerable or someone who's suffering, I think I have a moral obligation to empathize with that individual and to try to create a relationship within which it's a mutual thing. I certainly don't want to be sitting with someone, if I'm a journalist, who thinks that, who maybe has his or her own stereotype, right, about me as a journalist, and thinks, well, you're just here to get information and you don't really care about me. And you want to dissolve that as well, right? And so you have to be able to make that happen by being empathetic yourself. And I think slowly, then the individual who's vulnerable could come to trust you, and then the conversation can open up and go further. But there has to be trust.
Yeah.
Why else would someone engage with you, especially someone who's maybe part of a group of people who typically get stereotyped in our society? It must be, I think, a very frightening thing to be interviewed by someone. If I had been a single mother on welfare in the 90s, I would not have wanted to have been interviewed by anyone, because the inclination on the part of, and the media too, was to place blame at the feet of the single mothers on welfare, not to look at the system and perhaps the role that it was playing in poverty.
Yeah, because you feel like you're going to be judged. You're going to be just put into a stereotype, and you don't want to share, who you are, because it's going to be painful to be stereotyped like that. So I'd rather just maybe they just rather just not be involved. And
it's that one of the examples, best examples I think I have of that is the work of Steve Young, who is no longer with the Argus Leader, our daily newspaper here in town, but who was for many years an Argus Leader reporter. And I talked to a number of people who served as his sources over the years. And they told me, and they're not, I haven't quoted all of these individuals in the book, but I talked to a number of people, and they said that they would talk to Steve Young because they knew that he was going to sort of give them a fair rap, that he wasn't going to buy into stereotypes, that he was going to try to get to the truth, that he was going to represent them fairly. And even if representing them fairly meant that things that they'd rather not be revealing to the world were revealed, they knew that he was being fair. And so they were willing to talk to him. And that's huge. You know, and it's you know, when David Finkel, I talked to David Finkel, and he wrote the book, The Good Soldiers, about the soldiers in Iraq at the time of the surge. And those soldiers, when asked, you know, what was that like for you in Iraq at that time, would say, ask David Finkel, he gets it. And there can't be any higher praise for a journalist than that, which is to say that somehow he managed to translate for the rest of society their reality accurately, authentically, fairly. That's huge. But they also said, one of the men that he worked with quite a lot said that he was a highly empathetic individual. And again, I think that the best journalists just do it naturally, and they maybe aren't even particularly thinking about the fact that I'm being empathetic. You know, some people do come to the act of empathy more naturally than do others. The individual I was sitting with when the wall went up, I don't know what that person is like in other kinds of situations. I just know what that was like on that day. But some people do it more easily, more naturally.
Well, it seems like that's what you're advocating for, is those two journalists that you're talking about are modeling that way of being, that empathic way of being. And then it's like trying to convey that for the whole field, that the whole field of journalism should be aware of this and perhaps change to more this way of being.
Yeah. You know, I think that empathy is something that we can practice on an everyday basis. And when I first started thinking that I wanted to pursue it as an area of research, I did it largely because I guess I was empathizing with my students. I had had a number of students over a handful of years who had said, you know, I really love reporting and writing, but I don't think I can be a journalist because I don't think that I can, you know, basically check my humanity at the door. And no matter how much I could argue that it wouldn't have to be that way, they could see sort of what was writ large, right? This is what the books were telling them that they were going to have to do and be. And they didn't want to compromise their humanity in that way. So they went off in other directions. And what a loss to the community of journalism to have those young people go elsewhere. I was going somewhere else with that thought, and I don't remember where.
Well, it sounds like you're saying, what I was hearing is like how you came to this topic of compassion and empathy, and that you were seeing sort of the pain that students had in terms of they were entering journalism, and then the journalism was telling them they had to like be objective, disconnect from their humanity in some way, and that was like painful. And they're saying, hey, I don't want to do this. I want to go in a different field where I can have more of a sense of integration, is kind of what I was understanding. And that was sort of like your motivation or inspiration for addressing this topic.
And it remains so, I think. You may recall an example in the book that comes from the Margaret Reagan, the reporter in Arizona, who said that she was a speaker at a university, and she was telling the students about an experience that she had had reporting on a story about a woman named Marta who had been trying to cross the desert into the United States and who had broken her leg and who had been left behind by her group. And so she ended up being able to travel with Border Patrol and Marta as they got her to a hospital. And once there, she was able to spend some time with her and talk to her. But before Marta left the hospital, Margaret asked her if there was anything that she needed. And Marta said, I think she said, clothes and crutches. And so this reporter went and got her clothes and crutches. And she said that the students that she was talking to, journalism students she was talking to about this, thought that she had really compromised her integrity as a reporter, that she had crossed a line and that she was, had become a participant in the story. And so they were opposed to her having chosen compassion as a way of responding to the situation. And she gave, I think, the proper moral response. She helped another human being who was suffering. And she said there was no one else who was in a position really to do that for her. So she did it. I say, bravo. Right?
So it's not giving up, it's not detaching and detaching from your care and concern and humanity. It's about it to be a good journalist. What I'm hearing is it's about, you know, bringing that to the fore, to the part of the relationship.
Yeah. Knowing when it's an acceptable way to respond, that compassion can be an acceptable way to respond. And I think that's what we've seen in some really tragic kinds of situations, like the hurricanes last fall and Hurricane Katrina. We've seen journalists simply choosing to respond compassionately and to put it before the journalism at times. Yeah.
Like I did notice in your writings, you know, I kind of went back through your CV and saw some of the papers you did, and looked like you had started on the topic of compassion for a while and then moved to empathy and compassion. So I'm kind of like wondering, yeah, don't tell anybody. I'm like wondering, I saw, there's some kind of an evolution happened in terms of your awareness of these terms. And I was wondering, like, how did that evolution, was it the compassion part started because the students were feeling disconnected, and then how did you make that, how did that your experience evolve to where you're kind of like focusing on empathy with kind of subtext compassion?
I can answer that. It evolved because I did start out focused. I was focusing on compassion and thinking about compassion, but as I decided that I really was going to immerse myself in this area, I found that there was a lot there. I had no idea how massive the literature on particularly empathy was. And so as soon as I started looking at compassion and reading more about compassion, empathy started just becoming a huge part of what it was that I ended up thinking about. And so I think that typically empathy is a precursor to compassion, that we feel and then we respond, and we hope that our response is going to alleviate the pain and suffering of someone else. And that's compassion. Empathy is getting us there. I think that there are some who would argue that they can't be separated out, but they're a package deal moving forward. Yeah.
I'm kind of into that they come together. And some of the compassion community, if you read that, they try to separate it out, and they say, you know, empathy kind of gets you to taking that action. But then I saw also, reading what you were saying, is that it's like that community seems to ignore that the empathy itself is probably one of the most healing agents that there is. Just the listening, and it's a full spectrum. It's like if somebody's happy and you empathize with them and hear them, it's kind of like their joy and happiness is, you know, double. It's you increase it. And so the full spectrum, and then you go into the painful emotions, being heard and seen and acknowledged and empathized with, is a healing agent in itself. It's like that just does a lot to cut the sense of, you know, alienation and pain or whatever the pain is. So I think that aspect of it gets, you know, like, I don't know if you came from Buddhism, or like a lot of the Buddhists kind of go into this kind of topic. So, and then, are you familiar with the human-centered design process? This is a process that comes out of Silicon Valley, and it's a real big proponent of empathy for creativity as a source of creativity. It says it's the design community that just designed, you know, everything around us is designed. Somebody thought about every single thing in our environment, you know, immediate environment. And to design this, the idea is the first thing is you need to know what effect it's going to have on people. What is going to be their felt, visceral experience. So to design a software program, to design a camera, design a computer screen, you have to be a good designer, you need to be aware of the felt experience. And so it's a huge component of that community. And it's moving into the schools, you know, with humans, with project-based learning and so forth. So this is all part of a larger, you know, movement, it seems to me, of, you know, and you're bringing it into journalism, which I think is so fantastic.
So
how are we on time? We're at an hour now. I don't know if we...
Are we?
I can keep going. I don't know how you are in terms of time. If you have some time constraints, I don't want to keep you past.
I didn't realize an hour had gone by. I have a little more time if you want to talk, and we can stop when you're ready.
Okay, I can go for hours.
I have company coming for dinner at about 5:30. My daughter.
Okay.
And my fiance,
so it sounds like you got about 20 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see, where were we? Oh, the culture of empathy. So the way I'm looking at this is we need to really, you're talking about transforming, you know, journalism. And I think that the journalism fits into a larger culture. And what we really need is to transform the culture to have empathy and care, you know, as foundational values. So we see something like the Florida shootings, right? I mean, here's someone has probably mental illness or, you know, whatever, or who knows what, I don't know what the story, but it was a lack of empathy for all the people he shot.
Oh, yeah.
So the healing agent, like how do we heal or actually head this off is, I mean, as a journalist, you can go and interview him, you know, what was his experience? You can interview all the people affected by it and, you know, share those stories and convey those stories. And that can be opening and healing. And we can also go upstream, like what is this person's history of how did they get to that? And I just interviewed someone who's dealing with empathy and the incarceration. And they were a lawyer who is dealing with appeals for murder, you know, people who had committed murder. And she had to study their background. He said, all those people were like, their life was a train wreck in slow motion or a car wreck in slow motion. At any point along that history, something could have happened to transform their lives, you know, some empathic, if they've been brought into some sort of connection. So it's like, I guess what I'm looking at is, I'm looking at the broader picture that, yeah, can journalists become sort of like advocates for a culture of empathy? That instead of seeing, it's kind of like, you know, if we have a war and you have nurses and doctors healing, they're trying to heal the pain that people that are wounded, but there's no transformation of the overall system that is creating these wars. There's a whole mindset that it's like that's where a culture of empathy needs to come into, it seems to me. So I guess I'm just kind of throwing that out because that's kind of like stuff I'm thinking about, that journalists could actually be activists in terms of being almost like mediators in terms of, you know, transforming society, for the whole society to be more empathic and integrative between all the different components.
And I think journalists can do that by doing more long-form journalism. You know, I talk in the book about the work of Andrea Elliott at the New York Times and the little girl named Dasani, who was growing up in poverty and who had such dreams and hopes and was such a marvelous little being and still is, right? And a lot of people responded to that. So she was heard, and that child was understood to be a human being who was suffering, and people closed the distance. And somehow that's what we have to do, close the distance so that we're all not living, some of us aren't living in cozy corners and others elsewhere, less cozy, and never the two shall meet. So I think that journalists can write these stories that go deeply into the culture and that make clear what it is that we need to do, and that a little girl named Dasani was suffering in New York City, and that somebody ought to care. You know, when I first read Jacob Riis's work, How the Other Half Lives, I started reading about Jacob Riis, you know, and he was writing back at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And he asked questions like, you know, does anybody care about these individuals who are living in these tenements where there's no light and no air? And he did. He invited readers to respond. He put it out there and said, don't we have an obligation here to others? And then, you know, jump forward 100 plus years, and I'm reading the work of our writer, Steve Young, and he's writing about Native Americans in South Dakota. And he wrote a series, and I think it was 5 parts. And it won, I'm going to forget the name of the actual award, but one of Harvard's Nieman Awards. It was beautifully written story of American Indians living on reservations in South Dakota. And he particularly focused on some young girls and young women. And at the end of his story, he closed by giving us a picture of a little girl who's on her bicycle and she's riding down the street on Pine Ridge Reservation. And she's just a little girl, right? Any little girl anywhere. And he makes that point and then says, but does anybody care?
Yeah, I remember
and I read that and I went, Steve. So I called him right up and I said, we have to talk about that. How did you get away with that? And he said, well, we talked long and hard about whether or not I could say that at the end of the series. Does anybody care? And we decided that question was on top of a lot of reportage that validated it, that there was good reason to ask that question and that he had the right to ask. And that's to say that I think we need brave journalism like that. And I think that the work that Steve Young did was brave, and the individuals I spoke to in Native American community trusted him. And they felt he told their story fairly. And I think that's brave journalism. And I think that what Andrea Elliott did at the New York Times is brave journalism, and all of these stories that try to break down the barriers so that we can be transported into someone else's world, resonate with them, care more deeply, understand, and see ourselves as equal in our humanity. And once we've gotten there, then, you know, empathy is truly possible. I was thinking when you were talking a minute ago about the work of Simon Baron-Cohen, is that right? I think that's right. And he has a book on the science of evil. And, yeah. He argues that evil is the absence of empathy, because as soon as empathy is gone, you can treat the other as an object and do anything you wish. And that makes me think of things like what happened in Florida. And, you know, I don't know that human being's story. I don't know anything, but yeah, it's hard to take in, to comprehend the immensity of what happened there and of the evil of it. I mean,
it would be. I thought of like interviewing the people who did these shootings and different school shootings to really hear what are they thinking about, or their experience with empathy. You know, like specifically, what was their what do they have to say about empathy? If it resonates with them, what does it mean? And you know, kind of go into depth would be. It seems like a great project. In terms of in terms of the asking about the girl on the bike, saying, you know, does anybody care about her? There is, in terms of building a culture of empathy, I mean, there's all kinds of issues, like, does her family have like empathy circles within the family? Like my family, we do empathy circles where we get together and use empathic listening to have like family dialogues, you know, or are the schools promoting it, etc. You know, that there's a larger, you know, bubbling up of this empathic approach and listening. So I guess that's a component of that, bigger picture. I was thinking. Was there a comment?
Oh, I was just going to say that yes, empathy should be. We're always in education looking for outcomes, right? Well, empathy should be listed as one of those outcomes that we want our students to leave our classrooms and our schools with.
Yeah.
That capacity to tap into their innate human potential for that.
And promote it and give ways of learning like that, those tools of acknowledgement and so forth. And you had maybe in closing, we could look at just a quick review of your ethics of empathy. I think you had 6 points, or if you wanted to just...
I have them written down right there.
Yeah. Well, it seemed, I can go through, I made kind of like notes about them. I didn't have them. But I thought like the first one seemed to be remove barriers to empathy and foster authenticity. It seemed, I mean, that's like what I got is the essence of it, that, part of creating empathy is to remove the barriers to empathy, and maybe a concept of being objective is almost like a barrier to empathy.
Yes, it can be. And so you have to engage in reflection, or you can't perhaps get there. I encourage my students to think about those things that might be barriers for them. I did a class last January, and we used a lot of different works. And students, one of the exercises they had to do was to choose someone whose life they believed was very different from their own, and to engage that person, to invite that person to sit with them, to engage that person in conversation, and to find ways to set aside the barriers that they had already identified, that they knew they were going into that conversation with. And I think they did it in a largely successful way, most of them. But part of what they realized was how difficult it was too. And that's important, that we realize that it can be hard and maybe even sometimes impossible. But we have to kind of come to terms with who we are.
Well, maybe sometime we could practice the empathy circle, which with some of your students, because that's what we use. I find it one of the best practices. It's sort of like Carl Rogers listening, but it's peer-to-peer. Instead of the therapist doing the listening, we do mutual empathic listening. So we have a group of maybe 4 in a circle. Okay. One person speaks. And they select who they're going to speak to. That person reflects back their understanding of what the person is saying until the person feels really heard and understood. Yeah. And then it's the listener's turn to select someone and be heard. So it's the same type of process, but everybody's equal in terms of the speaking and listening. And that's why, I think it's like the core of mediation skills, like just practicing that. You can really learn to bring people together and help facilitate, dialogue and, mutual understanding. And, once people understand each other and have that connection, sort of action sort of flows out of that. So
that would be a great thing to do in a classroom, just with the students who are there, put them together and try to create that kind of a listening circle.
Yeah, I can show you how to do that at some point. I'd love to do that. And then, so the second point with empathy gets past stereotypes. So if you're empathizing, you're getting rid of those, judgments. And I think that was the core of what I got that.
Yeah, we carry a lot of stereotypes around in our heads. And, if there was another point at which I decided that I wanted to look more deeply at compassion and then at empathy. And that was when I did my dissertation as a doctoral student. And I did focus on the way in which media were representing single mothers on welfare in the 90s, mid-90s, when we were creating welfare reform. And it became very clear to me that it became very clear to me because I did quantitative analysis that single mothers on welfare were being horribly stereotyped by the media and blamed for their poverty and misunderstood. And you could go right into all kinds of government documents that would describe the lives of single mothers on welfare. And what was described there was very different from what we were getting in the media. which were more likely to tap into the stereotypes. So clearly, it seemed to me, the questions that were being asked were ones that perpetuated the stereotypes rather than debunking them. And they needed to be debunked. So, you know, if you want to create a culture of empathy, right, then you have to debunk those stereotypes, because who was going to empathize with these single mothers on welfare when they were being portrayed as people who were simply responsible to blame for their own suffering?
So was a big inspiration for you then, was that aspect.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, wow. How you got into this.
My dissertation advisor told me, that's great, but now we have to finish this project. And then you go on and you do more on your own. So I did come back to it. And largely because of my students, who were my students before I went off to do my doctorate, right? And then I came back to Augustana. So I was here, went off, got a degree, came back again, and I've been here ever since. 29 years.
Oh, wow. Well, this is great that you're working on the topic of empathy. So glad you took up this this topic. Number 3 on your ethics of empathy, you say empathy listens more deeply. I mean, that was so it's sort of like the stereotype, right? The stereotype is a block. What I'm hearing is the listening is kind of going deeper past those stereotypes, and there's a depth to the
listening is huge, because as soon as I started reading about listening, one thing would lead to another, and I started reading about listening, and I found that there were people who were doing all kinds of research on listening and the way we listen and how we listen, and we have different styles of listening. So one person might be more people-oriented, and the person who is more people-oriented is more likely to be able to engage empathetically with someone else. So they're going to be looking for the subtle cues. They're going to be noticing if that person's voice changes or falters or whatever the case might be. And they're going to tap into that. And because they've done that, because they've engaged in that way, they're going to get information that they can use, as I've said before, to ask more questions. And so you can have somebody who's people-oriented and more empathetic. You might have somebody who's content-oriented, and they're going to do their work very carefully and listen carefully and make sure they have everything and make sure that it all makes sense. And then you could have somebody who's very time-oriented or task-oriented, and they're not listening, and you're talking and they're looking at their watch and wishing you'd hurry up. Well, they're missing out on a lot of information, and they're also disserving whoever their conversation partner is. So I think that we'd all be in better shape if we better understood the way we listen. And
so really be aware of your own way, kind of have some self-awareness of how you go about listening.
Yeah. And we tend to be dominant in one way or another, and we tend, I guess, to habituate. So I've tried to pay attention to myself when I'm listening and think, okay, how am I listening? You know, what is my style? And then you just know yourself a little bit better, right? And you can reflect on why you are or aren't doing as well as you might in engaging with someone else.
That's sort of that self-empathy, self-awareness, again, coming back to that. And if you can reveal that, again, you're adding to the deepening the relationship.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
So number 4, I have here, give voice to those who have not been heard. Being heard helps alleviate pain. This is my own synopsis of it. I don't have it right in front of me with how you put it, but it's that the listening. Oh, that's what you're saying, is the people who haven't had a voice. Then ethics of empathy tries to give those people a voice, and that giving them a voice in itself is a healing. It kind of helps relieve pain. Yeah,
and it's also just a basic democratic value, right? That we should be hearing all of the voices, and that we should have, journalism should be multi-perspectival. We should hear from all those different people who have any kind of a stake in whatever story it is we're telling. But I do think that if someone who hasn't been heard is suddenly heard, yes, you're helping perhaps to alleviate some pain there that might come from not having been heard previously, or worrying about how you're going to be portrayed. Because as I said, every time somebody sits down to have a conversation, that person makes him or herself vulnerable. And if you're someone who's vulnerable and you're a single mother on welfare, you're thinking, oh boy, here we go. I'm going to come out of this looking like a lazy mother who wants to have a lot of kids so I can get more money. And that's not the reality at all of a single mother on welfare.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the perception out there. And so there's a lot of risk involved in someone's opening up. So how do you get someone to open up?
Mm-hmm.
And caringly.
So to get people to open, be caring, and to give voice to those who have not been heard. Okay, and move on to number 5. So I'm going to rush through this a little bit because I know you have to go. The empathic writing allows readers to connect and then have compassion. I don't know if is that, I kind of made my own.
And resonation is number 5. That we've found that through literature, people are able to be, and so through a journalistic story that is nonfiction, people, you can, as the writer, you can transport someone into the reality of another human being in such a way that the reader can resonate, that you can see that you share some common human values and ways of being, that what that person wants is what you want too. And you can better understand them and see them as equal in their humanity to yourself, not pity them, because that's to immediately create distance between self and other. So to pity someone is to somehow put yourself in a superior position. Empathy can't happen, but to care, to show that you care, and to open up that conversation in that way.
Okay, so that by, are you saying that by sharing using narrative to convey their story is a way of sharing their felt experience, and that way the reader can connect to who that person is by connecting to that felt experience?
Yes.
Okay.
And going into the, sometimes into the thoughts and hopes and dreams of someone, and realizing, we're alike in that, and we're far more alike than different. And I'm not talking about Adolf Hitler anymore.
Yeah.
I'm talking about our regular relationships with real people in the world. And
yeah, it's like with your students, like you're seeing their pain, you can convey their stories of pain, and then within the mess of, with the objectivity and the disconnection within journalism, and people could understand that. And then the last one was about make better moral judgments.
I think that when you choose to connect with someone's suffering, you have made a choice in that moment to conduct yourself morally. And maybe that's a moral judgment. I mean, you are making a decision, right, to conduct yourself in a particular way based on that person's situation. And many would believe that all morality is based in compassion and in empathy, that's the groundwork.
So by moral judgment is based on empathy and compassion, are you saying? I don't quite know if I'm grasping.
I think so. I think for me, it's something along the lines of Margaret Regan, the reporter, making the decision to help Marta get her crutches and her clothes. That was a moral judgment on her part. That woman needed help, and she was there, and she could do it. And she took the compassionate route and helped that person. It was the right thing to do, but she had to come to that conclusion that her humanity was going to come before her obligations as an objective journalist.
Yeah, not to get involved in the story.
Yeah.
Not
to get involved in the story.
Well, I could keep talking for another hour or two, but I know you've got some company, company. So wait, sorry, I didn't catch that.
Oh, it's fun to talk to you. It's such a messy topic in so many ways, which I think is why people steer themselves away from it too often. It's messy. Empathy is messy, and the emotions are messy, but they're also intelligent, as so many are arguing today. And we need to give our attention to the intelligence of the emotions.
Yeah, and there's so much confusion about what we're talking about, too. That's why I was really grabbing a hold of the definition at the beginning. What? It's like,
get there?
Yeah, I think, I'm trying to do this more now because I've done about 300 of these interviews, and I'm saying, okay, I'm going to start with the definition. I'm going to grab a hold of this because I want to be really clear. Because, like I said, for 4 years I've been trying to talk with Paul Bloom, and I couldn't figure out what the heck he was talking about. And when I finally understood that he wasn't even talking about empathy, it was like, oh my goodness. It's like we were totally talking past each other. So I'm trying to get to the really, clear nub of what we're talking about. So that's why I kind of digging in. Yeah.
If someone is going to distance themselves from empathy, then they're distancing themselves from their very own humanity. And I just don't think that can be good.
Yeah.